When archaeologists encounter multiple different burial treatments within an archaeological or cultural context, we describe these as co-occurring. Now, these co-occurrences of mortuary treatments are more common than we might expect. From my own research in Transylvania, during the early Bronze Age, there are tumuli that contain both primary and secondary inhumations. In the Middle Bronze Age, where the burial rite has shifted to cremation as the dominant mode, we also still see primary inhumations being put into the same cemeteries as these cremation graves. Beyond the cemeteries in the Middle Bronze Age, we also see burial within settlements, and we see cremated remains being placed as offerings into previously constructed early Bronze Age tumuli. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about how we identify co-occurrence in mortuary treatments, and also what it means for our interpretation of the past. The first step in identifying the co-occurrence of different mortuary treatments is to get a sense of what the mortuary variation is within your particular archaeological context. This involves identifying the primary burial mode or modes that exist as kind of cultural norms. This also involves looking at variation and deviation from those norms to identify alternatives that people chose to those dominant modes. Once we've identified multiple different burial treatments, it's important to remember that those are archaeological phenomena. And those archaeological phenomena can have been created as the result of two different processes. The first is change over time. We can see a single mortuary tradition moving from one burial type to another burial type. In that process, it may produce a material record that has multiple different treatments. Alternatively, there may be different mortuary treatments that co-occur at the same time in that social context. For those, we need to demonstrate the contemporaneity of burial. Once we've demonstrated that multiple different burial modes were being used and employed at the same time, we can then start to ask, why did certain people get buried in one way and other people buried in a different way? Distinguishing between mortuary treatments that changed over time and the contemporaneous variation requires that we have radiocarbon dating protocols that are much more intense than archaeologists normally use. Now, traditionally, within a cemetery context, people might take 2 or 3 dates from the cemetery just to demonstrate where it is positioned in the overall time sequence of the cultural phase. Now, we need to date many samples from each individual burial treatment that we find to demonstrate their contemporaneity or to demonstrate that they don't overlap and that one changed into the other. Now, if we do find that mortuary variation is the byproduct of changing fashions and perhaps a long-term use of a single mortuary site, that is really interesting. But it's potentially more interesting to us as anthropologists to unpack what is happening when different mortuary treatments co-occur in the same cultural context. Once the contemporaneity of different mortuary treatments has been established, we can then look for possible explanations for this behavior. The first possible range of explanations are functional. For example, if a mortuary ritual is scheduled to occur at a particular time of the year, we may have a co-occurrence of both primary inhumations and secondary inhumations. The primary inhumations may represent people who died in pretty close time to that seasonal mortuary ritual. The secondary burials may be from people who died many months in advance, but whose bodies were defleshed and then transported and buried alongside the primary inhumations. We can identify these kind of functional explanations of a kind of a seasonal round, or maybe an annual or multi-decade round, by looking at some other evidence of seasonality. One such example are faunal remains. The teeth from animals may be able to tell us whether or not the mortuary ritual is occurring in the spring or in the fall, as the age profiles for the animals when they're slaughtered would be different. And those animals that may be interred as grave goods could come from funerary feasts and other things like that. Pollen and other paleobotanical evidence may provide an alternative line to think about seasonality as well. The second and most common thing that archaeologists do is to look at whether or not the different mortuary treatments line up with particular types of social identity. For this, we usually focus on things such as age, sex, gender, race, ethnicity, kin identity, household affiliation, broader village membership, and even things like membership in a political unit. Now, in addition to these broad social categories, we also look to see if there's variation within those categories. For example, there may be a particular mortuary treatment that's reserved for high-status females. In this case, we would expect that not all females will be treated in that way, only the small subset that are considered high status. The third thing we look for are individuals that don't receive a burial treatment that conforms with any others in that cultural context. These are often referred to as deviant burials. Now, deviant as a word has some negative connotations, and in some cases we talk about this as associated with people who may have broken social norms, such as categories as witches. Alternatively, in a more general sense, this deviant burial is all about deviation from burial norms and treatments. So any burial that does not follow the convention must be analyzed and asked, why does this individual not receive the treatment of the dominant mode or modes? One example of this from work that I've done is at the Mount of the Hostages in the Hill of Tara in Ireland. Now, during the early Bronze Age at this site, most of the burial activity is cremation, and it's focused on burial in urns on the kind of southeast, and northeast parts of the tomb. There's one individual, however, that is buried as an inhumation rather than a cremation, and is buried in the northwest quadrant of the tomb, the only burial in that part of the tomb. This individual, which has been dubbed Tara Boy, which might be a misnomer because it could also be a young female skeleton, has the mortuary treatment that is associated with what's going on in Wessex in the UK at the same time. The individual has material culture that comes from the UK and is following a different burial treatment. Now, was this a position of honor for this individual to be placed in a completely different part of the tomb than other individuals were? Or is this perhaps, again, a punishment, a sign of someone who's an other in that particular cultural context, who's not eligible to be buried in the way that everyone else is buried? We shouldn't expect everyone to receive the same mortuary treatment, which is why it's so important to identify all the different mortuary variation that exists within a particular cultural context. In certain cases where we do see a highly regimented burial treatment with no co-occurrence, that requires a lot of effort and adherence to a strong set of cultural rules. That tells us a lot about a cultural context. When we see variation from that and the co-occurrence of mortuary treatments, whether they're multiple burial norms or burial norms with deviant burials, that also tells us about that cultural context. In certain situations where we see different burial modes, they may be tied into other things such as variation in social identity. if we have different kinship identities being marked through different burial treatments, that allows us to start to unpack things like social difference and social hierarchy. Because in order to have hierarchical social ranking, we must first have social segmentation, differences between people, and that is marked and recognized. In this kind of way, we can see that the interpretation of co-occurrence of burials is predicated on our understanding of the variation and also kind of what people are choosing to memorialize in the mortuary context. Are people trying to obscure differences, or are they trying to play them up? Bringing this together, we must remember that different burial treatments have different set of pathways to them, which means that there are different people involved, there are different economic considerations, and there are potentially different choices that are being made. That means that there's some sort of political aspect to the employing of different co-occurring mortuary treatments. This is why it's so critical for archaeologists to have a great assessment of the range of variation within mortuary contexts and to explore all of them and understand even the smallest type of variation, which can provide hints to the broader social, economic, and political nature of that cultural context.